Already under relentless Israeli bombardment for months, Palestinians in northern Gaza are also going hungry. The UN Food Agency has halted aid deliveries, saying civil order has collapsed. So, how can Israel be stopped from using starvation as a weapon of war? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mohammed Jamjoom. The World Food Program is suspending aid deliveries to northern Gaza because it's too dangerous. The UN agency says the decision wasn't taken lightly and it knows more people risk dying of hunger. But it's adamant conditions need to improve and the safety of its trucks and staff have to be guaranteed. The move leaves hundreds of thousands of Palestinians facing possible famine. Just how bad is the situation in the north of the Strip? And is Israel's offensive a war of starvation? This is what we'll be discussing today. But first, this report from Dmitry Medvedenko.
At the beginning of its war on Gaza, Israel cut off supplies of everything Palestinians needed to survive, closing its 2 border crossings and bombing Rafah, the crossing linking Egypt to the Strip.
We are imposing a complete siege on Gaza. There will be no electricity, no food, no water, no fuel. Everything will be closed. We are fighting against human animals, and we are acting accordingly.
Before October the 7th, 500 trucks would enter Gaza daily. Most of the population depended on humanitarian assistance. After a week of relentless bombing, the Israeli army issued an evacuation order for northern Gaza. 1.1 million people had 24 hours to move to the south of the Strip for their own safety, it said. Many left, but others didn't. In the months that followed, even those so-called safe zones came under attack, and some families made the difficult decision to return home or to what was left of it. It was weeks into its assault before Israel allowed the first trucks back in, and far below pre-war numbers. The UN has repeatedly accused Israel of blocking almost all aid deliveries to the north. This year, it says only 10 of more than 60 planned convoys have reached northern Gaza. This is a rare day when one made it through. Desperate for anything to eat, people rush in.
Why does a kilogram of rice cost $19? There's no flour. We're eating animal feed to stop ourselves from feeling hungry.
People who used to have money at the beginning of the war no longer have any. How can people eat or drink? This is a war of starvation.
In January, the International Court of Justice ordered Israel to take immediate and effective measures to enable the provision of humanitarian assistance in Gaza. But Palestinians in the north say nothing has changed. Hunger, disease, displacement, and non-stop Israeli attacks. Dmitry Medvedenko, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
So what's the significance of the WFP's decision? And it's a good question for our guest today. Joining us from occupied East Jerusalem is Shaina, communications advisor for the Norwegian Refugee Council in Palestine. In Ramallah, in the occupied West Bank, is Nebal Farsakh, spokesperson for the Palestinian Red Crescent Society, which has delivered essential services to Palestinians since 1969. And from London, we're joined by Sara, the chief executive of ODI, a respected humanitarian policy think tank. A warm welcome to you all, and thanks so much for joining us today on Inside Story. Nebal, let me start with you today. More than 1 million people used to live in the north of the Gaza Strip. Now, the area is mostly destroyed. For those who chose to stay, or for those who chose to return, just how difficult has life become for them? How desperate is the situation, and how dire is the suffering?
It is extremely dire. We're talking about almost 700,000 Palestinians who are now in Gaza City and the north. Those people are completely denied access to humanitarian aid. We're talking about WFP ceasing operation and distributing aid in Gaza City. But we all know that since the beginning of the war in Gaza, Israel has imposed siege on Gaza City and the north. And this area is nearly completely cut off humanitarian aid. That's why the situation there is catastrophic. People are literally starving. Most people, they struggle even to have one meal. Most essential supplies are not available at the market. And even items which are available are extremely high. We're talking about 10, 20 times higher prices than normal. Just having a one egg is almost $2. I have heard closely from our colleagues in Jabalia, north of Gaza, and they have been telling me how they struggle every day in order to find food for their families.
Shaina, you heard Nebal there talk about how the situation is catastrophic. Now, the WFP previously warned of famine-like conditions affecting 2.3 million people in Gaza. They said that its teams witnessed unprecedented levels of desperation in the north just recently. Now, how bad, from what you're hearing, is the situation, and how fearful are you and your teams of how much worse it could get?
You know, we're hearing similar reports about the cost of food just simply being astronomical, if it even can be found. We have some colleagues who also remain in northern Gaza and Gaza City, and they have run out of flour, they've run out of corn, they're running out of animal fodder, they don't have any cooking oil. Really, they are struggling to survive. We've seen that the WFP reported that around 16% of children under the age of 2 are suffering from acute malnutrition in northern Gaza. This is only going to rise as aid convoys cannot access Gaza because it simply isn't safe. These are unbelievable conditions for humanitarians to be trying to work in. And imagine if it's this difficult for humanitarians, how difficult it is also for the civilian population that's struggling to survive.
Yeah, and Shaina, you were talking there about logistics, and I wanted to follow up with you about that because there are so many aid agencies who have complained about the cumbersome Israeli procedures that slow these aid trucks from getting into Gaza, that slow the flow of aid from getting into Gaza. I want to ask you about specifically how difficult it is getting the aid in. Not just that, but also once the aid is actually in, and it's not a huge amount that's getting in, but once it actually is in, how difficult it is for those aid agencies to actually pick up the aid and then distribute the aid.
Well, first of all, Israel has implemented these extremely cumbersome screening processes which delay aid. It's been difficult to track aid when it's coming in, be able to anticipate it. We've also seen recently that Israel has been targeting aid convoys, or the police officers, rather, who are accompanying aid convoys, which has led to the police no longer being willing to provide that service, meaning that convoys are being mobbed by desperate Palestinians struggling to get anything. So when trucks are managing to get into Gaza, having them travel from Rafah all the way in the south up to northern Gaza, it's very, very difficult for convoys to be able to make that journey and arrive to their destination with the aid with the complete package of aid, because so much of it is being looted along the way or being forced to be distributed to people who are in desperate need and struggling themselves. We desperately need, in addition to the massive scaling up of aid, the reduction of these cumbersome screening processes. We need additional access points, including from the north, from Erez, from the Carney crossing. We need additional ways to be getting aid in so that it reaches people more efficiently and can reach those throughout all of Gaza, all of whom are in desperate need, but particularly those in northern Gaza.
Sara, so the World Food Program is now saying that it's halting food deliveries to northern Gaza because conditions are too dangerous. Obviously, this is of huge significance when it comes to the impact it will have on people in northern Gaza getting that hugely needed aid. I mean, the WFP is essentially the backbone for food delivery in Gaza. So if they are pausing their distribution, what does this mean going forward? And can we expect to see other aid agencies essentially taking the same decision in the near term?
Yeah, that is a very real, danger that all humanitarian supplies to northern Gaza will stop. And this is in the context of a situation that, as my colleagues were just describing, is is desperate. We are seeing, suffering that is unspeakable throughout Gaza, but particularly in the north, where people have really been left without, support. I have very dear friends and colleagues who are, responding in these emergencies, people that have worked in some of the worst crises around the world, from Sudan to Yemen. And they're telling me that what they're seeing now, what they are witnessing, is something they've never witnessed in their very long careers as humanitarian actors around the world. Just to add a few figures to what my colleagues have already said, WFP talks about, potential famine, but we know that 500,000 Gazans are already in famine-like situation. And that, means that a lot of kids are starving, because a lot of the population of Gaza is made of young people, is made of children. We are seeing, blockages of convoys repeatedly. I mean, the UN said that from the 1st of January to the mid of February, 51% of planned aid deliveries to northern Gaza were denied access by Israeli authorities. And, in the month of January, only 10 of the 61, humanitarian aid missions that they had asked for were allowed by Israel north of Wadi Gaza. And I think that is really important to, stress, because Israel, as a warring party, has an obligation to facilitate humanitarian assistance, to allow humanitarian assistance into Gaza. Actually, they have an obligation as an occupying power to supply civilians in Gaza with goods. And they are, failing this obligation to ensure critical continuity of essential services and sort of protect civilians. So actually, when they can't sort of uphold this obligation, they absolutely must, according to international humanitarian law, allow unimpeded flow of humanitarian goods. And what we're seeing instead is just a trickling of, the odd track here and there for 2.3 million people.
Nebal, Sara was talking there about the risk of famine that is now being detected in Gaza, also talking about the responsibility that an occupying force has when it comes to the delivery of aid. Now, I want to ask you about the fact that the Palestinian Red Crescent has been warning that a number of people have died as a result of Israel's deliberate starvation and famine in Gaza. So I want to ask you, is what we are seeing right now war by starvation, and are Israel's actions in Gaza causing a famine?
Almost a quarter of population in Gaza are literally starving, and the rest of the population are, all of them, suffer from insecure access to food. Food insecurity is something that every single Palestinian in Gaza now suffer from. All people are suffer to have food, water, and even medicine. And I also stress out the importance of Israel as an occupying power have a responsibility to fulfill the needs of civilians in Gaza. Although, and despite this, Israel is using the humanitarian aid as a weapon against Palestinians, as a collective punishment to let the entire population starve. And we have been seeing people are literally starving. I'll tell you regarding our experience and our medical post, which we have established in Jabalia, north of Gaza. According to our volunteers there, they are telling us the medical post is receiving many cases for children who suffer from severe malnutrition. And those children are literally starving because they don't have access to food. Many of them as well start getting infectious diseases, hepatitis A. According to the figures, at least 700,000 Palestinians in Gaza Strip caught in contagious diseases such as respiratory diseases, skin diseases, and other diseases. The situation is extremely dangerous, and Palestinians, if they don't lose their lives directly because of the bombardments, they will because of starvation and infectious diseases. The level of starvation, particularly in Gaza City and the north, has reached a very dangerous stage.
Sara, I want to come back to you about a point you were making about the obligation under international humanitarian law when it comes to occupying forces, when it comes to the delivery of aid. In January, the International Court of Justice ordered Israel to take immediate and effective measures to enable the provision of humanitarian assistance in Gaza. But The Palestinians in the north, in Gaza, say nothing has changed, that things have only gotten worse. Aid agencies say the same. The framework for international humanitarian law, it's being challenged in ways now that it has not been challenged before. Isn't that correct?
It is sadly really correct and very dangerous because, what we have seen over the past few months since the attack by Hamas on the 7th of October is a flouting of international humanitarian law at a level unseen before. I mean, obviously, Hamas attack was unconscionable, but, reciprocal crimes against humanity cannot be accepted as a proxy. The laws of war exist to preserve humanity in the midst of fighting. They're there really to give us a moral compass to limit the suffering of civilians. And the parties are required to exercise restraint and abide by the Geneva Conventions. And just to explain what this means, it is the parties need to exercise a distinction between civilians and military targets. They need to use due precaution to prevent harm to civilians. They need to make sure that the damage to civilians is proportionate compared to any anticipated military advantage gained. I would argue that Israel is failing all of these tests, and it's failed them so far, is continuing to fail them. As people say, in the ICJ interim ruling hasn't really changed anything. Now, even if Israel is acting in self-defense, even if Hamas, continues to hold hostages and commit criminal actions, these cannot be used to justify what is really the collective punishment of 2.3 million Palestinians in Gaza, the majority of whom are children, as I've already said. It can be justified, it can be used to justify forcible transfer of civilian population, bombardment of civilian localities, all, the failure of providing humanitarian relief, all things that are, a violation of the national humanitarian laws. And I would also add that the failure of other states, of third-party states, to prevent these violations is basically complicity. We've seen Western democracy, they are violating themselves some of the most fundamental commitments to international humanitarian law and human rights law.
Shaina, I saw you reacting to a lot of what Sara was saying there, and it looked to me like you wanted to jump in, so I'm going to let you go ahead.
No, I mean, Sarah's absolutely right that we're seeing starvation being used as a weapon of war, and that Israel has completely ignored, evaded, denied its responsibility towards the occupied population. It was Israel, remember, who within the first day or two of this war declared that they would cut off all electricity, water, and fuel supplies. And we saw that the International Court of Justice reaffirmed Israel's role and responsibility as the occupying power to provide for the basic necessities of the protected population, in this case, the Palestinians in Gaza. I think what we're concerned about as we see starvation levels grow, particularly in northern Gaza, is that this is just another coercive measure that Israel is taking to depopulate northern Gaza, to forcibly transfer, in violation of international humanitarian law, the population there and force them really out to south of Wadi Gaza, to the middle area, to Khan Yunis, to Rafah, or perhaps even out to Egypt, as we've seen as this looming ground offensive or ground operation in Rafah continues to be previewed. And so it's essential that we continue to, first and foremost, demand a ceasefire, which will, of course, allow for conditions that are better for and appropriate for humanitarians to be responding. But we also need the international community to put pressure on Israel to fulfill these obligations under international law. And if they are not willing to provide the basic needs for survival of the protected population, they at the very least need to facilitate third parties, humanitarian agencies, the UN, in fulfilling those obligations on their behalf.
Nebal, I know we touched on this a little bit earlier in the show, but we need to remember that the World Food Program had only just resumed aid deliveries to northern Gaza after a 3-week suspension that had taken place. Now they're stopping yet again. They say it's just simply too dangerous. This really underscores how dangerous things are for civilians in the north, too, right?
Exactly. Civilians, since the beginning of the war, have been denied access to humanitarian aid. I absolutely understand how humanitarian agencies struggle to get the aid into Gaza, especially after many attempts were faced by refusal from Israeli authorities to allow the entry of humanitarian aid. And even the number of humanitarian aid trucks that are allowed to go into Gaza City and the north, we're talking about just a few number of aid trucks. That's why we have seen people very desperate trying to jump into the trucks and take anything they can take, because people only want to survive. The level and the stage of dangers of how people are literally starving in Gaza City and the north, it can't be imagined. We have said that repeatedly. People started even to grant animals beans in order to have a flour to make bread. The situation there is dire, and we also continue to confirm that the situation, generally speaking, regarding the humanitarian aid, Israel is the one who is obstructing the entry of a humanitarian aid into Gaza Strip. Before the war on Gaza, Gaza was receiving around 500 aid trucks daily. Today, even when both crossings, Rafah and Kerem Abu Salem, are open, a maximum of 170 aid trucks are getting in. That means we are far away from the number of aid trucks that should be allowed to be in so we can fulfill the needs of people. The aid trucks that are allowing to get in doesn't even scratch the surface. We're talking about a 5th month of war in Gaza. There is many needs that is related to the emergency situation we are in, which means we need to have relief items in order to be provided for almost 90% of the population who became IDPs. This wasn't a need before the war. This is something that is new, and it's related to the emergency situation. And instead of increasing the aid truck, we're getting less aid trucks. At least if we take this into consideration, in addition to the increasing needs of hospitals, since they are dealing with more injuries and they need more supplies, more medicines, we need to have double or triple trucks in order to fulfill the needs of people. On
And
top
Sara,
of that,
sorry
we
to
need
interrupt.
to have access to all areas in Gaza City, and not just to leave Gaza City and the north completely denied access of humanitarian aid.
And Sara, also, just to contextualize a bit more, you're talking about the fact that before October 7th, there were around 500 trucks of aid per day that would enter Gaza. And even then, most of the population was dependent upon humanitarian assistance. So the fact that aid has massively decreased since then only showcases how much worse the situation is getting, right?
Just a few weeks ago is the suspension of funding to UNRWA, which was, the lifeline for so many Palestinians in Gaza, and practically has no money to continue to support Palestinians. So we can just imagine how this has aggravated a situation that was already really deeply desperate for so many people on the ground.
Shaina, if I could ask you, the fact of the matter is, we're talking about how, as you said, more international pressure needs to be applied in order to get more aid into Gaza. But let me ask you this. Even if there were more crossings that were opened, does that immediately make the situation better, or are there still a lot of obstacles to overcome?
Well, of course, the situation, it needs more than just the opening of crossings. We need and the scaling up of aid. The amount of devastation and destruction throughout all of Gaza is going to take years to rebuild, let alone, of course, the psychological trauma that will, I'm sure, last for generations after all that the people of Gaza have experienced over the last 4.5 months. But it is a first step in terms of allowing for the entry of more goods. The other thing on top of just having more entry points that would make it easier to access more areas of Gaza, is that we need restrictions to be lifted in terms of what can enter Gaza. There have been reports of relief items being denied entry, including things as simple as tent poles or toolkits to help that are included in shelter kits to help seal off homes. So we need those restrictions to be lifted as well, to allow not only for a greater influx of goods, but a greater variety of goods that are entering that can help and support the relief effort. That also includes machinery. One of the major issues right now that's also hampering the delivery of aid is the lack of even things as simple as forklifts to be able to offload aid into warehouses and be able to take inventory and figure out how to distribute it. Things like fuel to be able to get to different areas of Gaza and be able to distribute aid. Restoration of telecommunications. All of these things
Shaina,
are needed for there to be a robust
I'm sorry to
response.
interrupt. We just don't have a whole lot of time left. Nebal, I want to ask you one last question. We have just about 2 minutes left. From your perspective right now, as dire as the situation is, what needs to happen right away in order for the situation to improve?
We would continue to call on a ceasefire. We can't, as a humanitarian agencies, operate under such horrific conditions. This war needs to be end, and we need protection for civilians, since we're talking about 70% of the victims are children and women. We don't want people just to die with full stomach. First, we need them to be protected, and second, we need a safe, unembedded humanitarian aid access into Gaza through all borders and the new points. And we need also to be able to distribute aid in all areas in Gaza and not still, and to break the siege that is imposed since the beginning of the war on Gaza, on the area of Gaza City and the North. Gaza City and the North, 700,000 people there are civilians, and they do have a right to have access to food and water. And we need this access to be guaranteed. We need also a safe access for us as a humanitarians, not to be targeted while we are implementing our life-saving missions, trying to alleviate the suffering of people in Gaza.
All right. Well, we have run out of time, so we're going to have to leave the conversation there. Thanks so much to all of our guests, Shaina Low, Nebal Farsakh, and Sara Pantuliano. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. For me, Mohammed, Jamjoom, and the whole team here, bye for now.